Hey everybody. So for today, we're going to start talking about the layer styles in Photoshop. Being able to effectively use the layer styles allows you to create a lot more depth and dimension to your designs in Photoshop. And knowing all the different choices is going to give you a lot of different options that you may not have always been aware of. So first, I'm going to start by downloading my layer styles worksheet off of the class website. These are Photoshop-based worksheets, and they will open up directly in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this one, and you're going to see that I have a collection of activities for you that are going to let you really figure out what layer styles are all about. So I have this broken up into two artboards for you. And inside of the two different artboards, I do have layers that are locked so that you cannot accidentally mess up anything on the worksheet, so you don't have to worry about that. We're going to start with artboard 1, and I'm going to zoom in on the start of this, all these beautiful pink dots, because if you know me, is to know that pink is my favorite color. When we're in Photoshop, one of the wonderful updates that's just recently happened in the newer versions since about 2018 is the ability to click on a layer and it automatically activate in Photoshop, just like it would if we were in Adobe Illustrator. Once upon a time, this had to have been done by finding the layer that you needed and clicking on the actual layer that you need, but that's no more, thankfully. Now I can just click on the layer and it will automatically activate the correct layer for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by adding some different layer styles. And at the top of each box, I've told you which layer style it is I'm looking for. And what this is going to allow for you to do is to really see how to manipulate and change. So I'm going to go through these one at a time and talk about what they're for and what their benefits are and different ways you can use them. So I'm going to start here, and you can activate the layer style panel by two ways. One, I can go to the layers menu. I can go to layer style and I can choose whichever layer style I want to use. So for example, bevel and emboss. And then it will activate our layer style panel. I'm going to cancel this out because the other way you can do this, which is my preferred method, is on the layer here in the dark gray section next to the name. I'm going to double click, and then it will also activate the layer style. I think that's just a lot more efficient, so that tends to be what I prefer. I'm gonna move my panel over so that you can watch as I add a bevel and an emboss on my pink dot here. Now, inside each layer panel option, you have different choices and different options that pop up that let you change, for example, the depth, my size, and you can watch it change here. I can soften up that edge so it's not quite so harsh, and I can kind of continue to manipulate, and I can end up getting something that's very rounded looking or kind of flat, like you pressed it down with a book. I can also change the contours of the way the shading looks, and different shading's going to look different ways, and just kind of depending on the look you're trying to go for. You can also change the angle of that shading, and it would change the kind of the light source, so to speak, of that bevel and an emboss. You can also just type in those numbers if you would like. And then you get this beautiful kind of three-dimensional looking thing. But let's say I want to change it. All I do is go back to where that bevel and emboss is and double click, and I can continue to adjust and change the look of my bevel and my emboss. Easy. And then I just say okay. Now the nice thing is I'm going to go to the contour. We're going to keep going. Contour, if you wanted to do multiple layer styles, you can, which is awesome. So now if I just want to contour, I can come over and not have the texture issue and the emboss. I can just have the contour. So then again, this can change and adjust based on the look you're looking for. So again, you decide which one you want to use. Most of the time you're going to use bevel and emboss with the contour. You very rarely use it by itself. So feel free just to kind of pick one just to show me you know how to do it. Texture. Texture is one of those things, and you've heard me talk about this before, where less is kind of more on the texture. Now, Adobe Photoshop has embedded just a handful of textures in here for you to kind of play with, but you can always install more textures if you want. There used to be some really awful ones in here, like snake grass or snake Scales, which is funny because my name is Scales. But you have some different choices, and you can always come in here and you can actually add or import patterns if you want to add other kind of texture options beyond this, and you just would have to have those files ready to be imported. And a lot of websites, if you go online, you can usually find some different ones, and then Adobe itself would have some more texture for you. So just kind of pick one here just to show me you know how to add some texture. And then up here, you can change, or down here, you can change the scale and the depth of it, and you can kind of determine the way you want it to look depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. Over on the stroke, this should be very familiar to everybody. We did strokes in Illustrator, so I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to add a stroke, and I can adjust the size of that stroke, and I can adjust the color of my stroke so that I can determine how much or how little. I can also determine the opacity of that stroke, and I can also determine whether it's on the outside, the inside, or it's centered inside my stroke. So it means it's not going to take up as much space. So most people, the default is the inside. But you can really kind of sit here and adjust all of this. And then you can also choose to make things your default if you want that to save as your default, but most people don't. I'm going to do an inner shadow next, which is just like a drop shadow, but instead it's going to go inside my shadow instead of on the outside. So if you can see, it's forming on the inside of my item here. And I did that so you could see where it cuts off and where it doesn't cut off. And I can change the distance. I can change the size where it's softer or much harder. I can change the choke, which means kind of how far in and how far out it goes. But this lets you create some really interesting uses of depth, and you can change the opacity. And I use this when I want to create something that looks like it has a little bit more depth from something below. All right, the inner glow, we're gonna do that one next. Inner glow is right here. And what the inner glow lets me do is it kind of lets me put a glow around the inside of something. So again, I'm going to turn up my noise is what we adjust for this one. And hopefully you can see that glow change. I'm going to turn my opacity up so you guys can see. There it goes. You see the glow start popping up, the inner glow. I will be honest, and you can change the size. You can change the choke. I don't use this one a lot. I'm going to be very real with you. I don't ever find a huge amount of benefits for it unless I'm doing something very like glow specific, like a text effect maybe that I want to include a glow on. Do I use the inner glow? All right, we're going to go to satin next. Satin, when I turn on satin, creates kind of this like this kind of sheen, and I can change the color of my satin sheen. So if I wanted to do maybe like a much darker color of satin sheen in the same family to maybe get a little bit more realistic. And again, I can change the opacity. I can change the distance, which kind of creates those almost like those gleams, like satin fabric, so to speak. And you can kind of see that that's the origin of it. And then we kind of soften it down depending on what we're trying to look for. Again, this is good for texture, adding kind of more three-dimensionality. I use this usually hand in hand with the bevel and the emboss to get that kind of shiny look. Color overlay, just like it sounds, is you're going to take another color and change that design or whatever that is into a new color. You have blending modes here, which we're going to talk about in the next worksheet. But I use this a lot when I have something that's already created that's not a shape, for example, or a text box that I want to change the color on and I don't want to have to redo it all. Gradient overlay does the exact same thing, but instead of being a solid color, we're just going to put a gradient over it. So I'm going to come down here and just find one that I like. And you can just add a gradient on here depending on what it is you're looking for. You can change the scale. You can change the angle of your gradient. So this is kind of nice. Again, if you already have something that you wanted to put a gradient on that was already kind of a set shape or an image, you have that ability. Pattern overlay is just kind of like the texture, but instead of a texture, it's actually going to put in the actual true image here and not just the texture of that image. You're actually going to get the full pattern here instead. So again, these can be added. You can download more. You can change the scale of that pattern just kind of depending on what it is you're trying to get, and it will reprint or recreate that pattern depending on, again, how much of that you want to show and how much you don't want to show. You can make it very big and very small. Again, there are so many patterns and things that you can download. I just don't use this one a lot. However, I do use Outer Glow a little bit more, and I use Drop Shadow the most. So Outer Glow is just going to be like that inner glow where I can change the spread, but this time instead of going on the inside, it's just going to go on the outside. So you can see it kind of glow. Again, I use this a lot for text effects. What's also neat is I can change the color of that glow, which can kind of be really neat and give you some neat effects that you wouldn't have gotten normally. And then the last but not least is my favorite, is a drop shadow. I love a drop shadow. I use it way more than I probably should. With the drop shadow, you can change the distance. You can change the spread. The spread is going to be how, if I pull this one out, how much it's out and how much it's in. You can see it kind of shifting here slightly. The size is going to be how soft that shadow is versus how hard that shadow is. One of the things that we talk about, we will talk about more and more with a shadow. If you want it to look like it's sitting on the surface, you want to make sure that you pay attention to these sizes, because if you look at the shadow of your hand on a table, the line is never going to be this soft blur. Very rarely. You usually have a very firm edge if you're looking for realism, which again, in Photoshop, we always want realism. We don't want it to look Photoshopped if we can at all help that. So if you want something to look like it's floating, then that's where you would really kind of blur out your shadow more, like it's kind of coming up. If you put your hand on the desk and pull it up slowly, you can see the shadow getting lighter and softer. So if you want to make it look like something's floating, you can easily do that with a drop shadow. Okay. That is all of your layer styles. Now, on the second page, what I'm asking for you to do is for you to go through and on these, and I'm on Artboard 2 now, you're just gonna add the styles that I've asked for so that you can see the way we combine layer styles. So I'm gonna add a bevel and emboss, a drop shadow, and I'm going to add an interglow. But I'm going to ask you to go back through here and kind of mess with the settings and get something that you think looks pretty neat. You know, you don't want to get anything that looks super distracting. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit. And I think that looks kind of nice. I'm going to pull the size down on these until I get something that kind of looks like I was looking for. And I think that's kind of freaking me out a little. So I'm going to pull my inner glow down a little bit, so it's just a little softer. And then I'm just going to say, okay. So I want you to do number 2 on your own. On number 3, I want you to see if you can figure out by trial and error what layer styles I use to make my elephant look that way. And same for number 4. What did I do to make my donut look like it has I'm not going to tell you what that's called, 2 colors changing, and has that kind of 3-dimensional look. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Layer Styles worksheet in Photoshop. Thanks.